Well, at the next section of the program, we've got the much anticipated keynote by Heather Joseph, the director of SPARC. Heather is joining us for the second time. She was chairing the panel, the leadership panel at the university yesterday. Just a brief introduction. Heather Joseph is the executive director of the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, SPARC, an international coalition of academic and research libraries promoting the open sharing of knowledge. Under her stewardship, SPARC has become the leading advocacy organization promoting innovative, open and equitable global systems of research and education. Of course, prior to that, she has been holding many key roles at Bio1 and other publishers. Please join me on welcoming her for the second time during this conference to the virtual podium online connecting to us. Heather Jones.
Thank you so much. Just making sure that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And I'd really like to start by extending my thanks to the conference organizers and partners at the Knowledge E Foundation, Khalifa University, the UAE Ministry of Education and of Culture and Youth, and to UNESCO for really the honor and privilege of participating in this timely and important annual forum on open research. I'm particularly grateful to have the opportunity to speak now to follow up on so many of the key themes that have been raised during the past 2 days of discussion. And what I'd like to do with this time is to really use it to underscore once again, not only why it's important to open up research practices, policies, and norms, but to really hone in on some options for how we might do so individually and collectively. The organization that I've been fortunate enough to lead for the last 2 decades, SPARC, is tasked with being a catalyst for action in the global community, with not only working to be able to understand and to articulate the sweeping, inspirational, and aspirational drivers for openly sharing research and scholarship, but also with focusing in on how to identify and activate points of action to make meaningful progress towards that end goal. And that end goal, as we've heard time and time again over the last 2 days, is really the notion that sharing knowledge is fundamental to the progress of society, and that everyone, everywhere, should be able to not only be able to access knowledge, but to contribute to and benefit from the open sharing of knowledge. And we recognize that we're really truly at a moment in our shared global history where this goal, as lofty and as aspirational as it may sound, is really for the first time something that's eminently achievable. With really the advent of network digital technology, the internet, and the growing ubiquity of network connectivity, we have a unique moment to make significant progress towards this goal together, a reality. We've heard again over the last 2 days that the recognition that enabling fast, barrier-free, or open knowledge sharing has the potential to produce just incredibly sweeping benefits. When we talk about accelerating discovery, we mean doing things from speeding the translation of basic research into treatments, cures for diseases, fueling innovation, and creating new and innovative ways to share knowledge. We've talked about the move from sort of monodisciplinary research to interdisciplinary, intradisciplinary, collaborative team research, and the ability, the necessity for open knowledge sharing to do this, and to do it in order to improve the health, the lives, and the well-being of all people. And this notion of knowledge sharing and open knowledge sharing is really codified in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 27 notes specifically that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and more specifically for our purposes today, to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And the United Nations and the global community further have recognized that ensuring open sharing of knowledge is essential in order to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, which are, as we all know, a driving force to combat inequality and injustice across every sector of society. When we look at the SDGs, we recognize that from ending poverty to ensuring quality education, to improving life on land and on the water, these goals are universally dependent on the free flow of information and of knowledge among communities and across geographic and geopolitical borders to succeed. And they're also large-scale goals, right? These are not small, simple goals. They're quite complex. And by their nature, I think the SDGs are very important in underscoring that the changes that we need to improve the way we share knowledge in order to make this kind of progress have to also meet the moment. They need to take place on a global systems level. We need strategies and solutions that really can facilitate change at a complex and multidisciplinary level. And I think that that's what makes the use of open such an appealing approach. It has the ability to meet the moment. I do want to start, though, also by saying that when we talk about using open, we should be clear what it is that we're advocating for. And too often, I think in our conversations and discussions around open access to knowledge, open access to research or data, the emphasis that we have is sometimes mistakenly placed on open in and of itself, as if that is the outcome that we're working towards. And I think as we think about what kinds of actions are necessary to help us implement the sweeping vision of everyone everywhere being able to openly share knowledge, we have to remember that open is simply an enabling strategy, a tool to help us achieve progress towards that larger goal and towards the goals that are milestones along the way, like achieving the SDGs. We're not talking about open access, open research for the sake of open, not open for open's sake, but rather open in order to. Opening up access to research articles in order to speed up progress towards curing cancer or preventing a pandemic. Opening up access to research data in order to help local communities ensure access to clean water or to mitigate the local effects of climate change. Opening up access to textbooks in order to make higher education more attainable, more affordable to more people. So I really do want to place an emphasis on thinking about using open as an enabling tool or strategy in the knowledge environment, because I think it can really help us facilitate the conditions under which we can best address the most complex and multidisciplinary challenges facing society, right? So one of the themes of this closing keynote in terms of how we think about framing the actions or building the action sets that we undertake together is really this notion of open as an enabling strategy. And we see what happens when we do this effectively, right? When we actually use it as a tool to help us address a complex problem. We saw that happen in real time during COVID. And I know that the example of COVID is something it has been used multiple times and we talk about fairly frequently. And I also recognize that it's not a perfect example, but I do think it is a critical illustration of what's possible when the barriers for sharing the basic building blocks of research are dropped up front. I know you are all aware that one of the first things that happened in the early days of the pandemic in early March of 2020 was that science ministers from around the world quickly issued a plea for the paywalls around all coronavirus related research articles to be dropped, and for all primary research data being collected on the novel COVID-19 virus to be shared openly and without delay. And that ethos of of sharing by default, right? Changing the normative expectation of sharing by default was certainly a contributing factor to the fastest time frame from sequencing a genome of a virus to producing an effective vaccine in human history. It wasn't the only contributor, but it was an important enabler, an important enabling strategy. And in addition, we know that in the era that we live in, where misinformation and disinformation abounds, the truth is becoming increasingly fragile. And the open sharing of knowledge can help us to improve the reliability and the quality of research. And in doing so, help us shore up the public trust in this critical layer of global knowledge. Open sharing of information is not a panacea for eliminating these challenges, but it introduces an element of transparency, of accountability, to help build that trust. And it becomes an important component of any strategy that we have to mitigate these challenges. And as we've heard again over the last several days, and as is becoming increasingly ubiquitous in our conversations, open sharing of knowledge is important as we in the higher education and research communities grapple with our roles and responsibilities to ensure that with the emergence of AI tools and systems, that we're paying attention to the way that they're managed so that they're adopted, managed, governed in ways that are ethical and equitable. For example, as we consider the tsunami of generative AI tools and technology that we're faced with evaluating and determining how we will either incorporate or not incorporate into our workflows in higher education and research, we want to, in our community, ensure that the knowledge bases that are used, for example, for their training are as reliable and as trusted, as robust, and as comprehensive as possible. And the open, equitable sharing of knowledge has a key role to play in creating and in maintaining such critical emerging national and global resources. So as we think about the role that we each can play as individuals and also on behalf of our institutions to actively promote the open sharing of knowledge and research, we need to be as deliberate as possible to also think about the importance of ensuring that we're doing so in a way that benefits more people, not less. We need to make sure that any action that we take in service of knowledge sharing is equitable as well as empowers open. At SPARC, when we're thinking about creating action strategies, we've sort of created a bit of a shorthand for thinking about what sort of bar do actions need to rise to be something that we feel that we as players, as individuals, as constituents, and as collaborators in the global knowledge sharing system, want to put our effort, our resources, our time, our people into promoting. And we've sort of shorthanded the need to center this kind of expansive, inclusive thinking as the duality of making sure that every action that we take is geared towards building and ensuring that the systems of research and knowledge sharing that we're promoting are both open by default, resetting that norm and expectation, but also equitable by design. And again, from the conversations that we had, particularly in many of the parallel sessions, we recognize that you can, in fact, build open sharing systems for sharing research or communicating research, for example, research articles that are open, but may not meet that bar for being equitable by design. They may be open in terms of providing the ability for articles to be accessed, but depending on the kind of business model that's used, they may introduce barriers that keep people from being able to participate or contribute to the knowledge base as fully as possible. So we have to be consistent and intentional about the actions that we take to make sure that they meet the bar on both ends of sort of this the duality of this equation. So open by default and equitable by design are sort of our overarching blueprint for the bar that actions need to meet to effectively meet our goal. So how do we do this, right? How do we go from this aspirational goal and break it down into concrete, tractable actions that we as individuals or as institutions can take to make this goal really a reality for us as a global community? We're very fortunate that we start from an excellent set of global frameworks. In particular, the UNESCO recommendations on open science provides a fantastic international framework for open science policies and practices that really emphasize using open as the default mode and as an enabling strategy, and respect the need for building equity in at every phase of the system. And I just want to take a quick moment to say how delighted I am to be able to be promoting the UNESCO framework as someone who's resident in Washington, D.C. and is based in the United States, that the United States finally rejoined UNESCO and this year, and I get to promote now as an active contributing member state to UNESCO. So we're so grateful to our colleagues at UNESCO for the incredible and incredibly important work of constructing this framework, and it's a privilege to finally be able to support as an active member state. But this framework really is something that allows us to start from first principles that are globally accepted and begin to move down the continuum towards breaking things down into steps for tangible action. So at SPARC, one of the things that we do and we find very useful is to start with the UNESCO framework and then to break things down further into key action areas or choice points, if you will. And we tend to think about 3 areas of choice points in the open research space that are kind of useful to move along this continuum. We think that making progress towards this larger goal really requires changing 3 things: changing the policies that govern the underlying sort of rules of the road for operating in research and education, the practices, the day-to-day way that individual researchers and scholars conduct the work that they do and communicate their work, and changing the norms, the expectations and the values that are resident in the research and education community. These are still 3 fairly large areas, but at least by beginning to categorize and break down into buckets, you can also begin to map actions that are needed in each of these areas and to start to scope areas that are tractable enough for effective intervention. Effective intervention, right? So thinking about it from the perspective of where you are, what your role is in the research and education ecosystem is sort of the second dimension that we find is very helpful for constructing and deciding on what actions you may be uniquely positioned to take. For example, if you think about, okay, I can take an action to try to change the policy environment, day-to-day practices or norms, starting from where it is that what it is your role is on a daily basis can be very useful. If you're a funder or a university administrator, for example, you may be much closer to having the ability and the authority to change and to evolve local policies to support knowledge sharing. So you may consider taking action starting in that arena. Whereas if you're a researcher or a publisher, it may feel like changing national policy or funder policies is a little bit more of a reach to start with. But you can certainly start by thinking about what can I change in my day-to-day work, in the way that I'm doing or communicating my work, simply to make sure that I'm doing it in a way that is moving down the continuum towards more open and equitable sharing. Or if I'm a member or a leader in a scholarly society or a disciplinary community of some sort, what can I do to make sure that the norms and the values that my community, that my society is promoting supports open and equitable sharing of knowledge. Taking these two things together, right? Sort of starting from these tractable buckets of policy, practice, and norms, and then approaching it from what am I uniquely positioned? What role am I uniquely positioned to play in creating actions that will enable momentum and progress towards these end goals? I think is a really useful place to start. I want to just take a few minutes to look at a couple of examples of how this can play out in each of these three areas. And starting with policy, we're really fortunate that in the area of open research, we have about 2 decades of groundwork that has already been laid in the policy environment. So we have really excellent examples and exemplars of policies to work off of if we're choosing to take action to continue to move the needle forward in the policy arena. Over the last 2 decades, the development and adoption of open policies, for example, this slide illustrates the development and adoption of open policies for sharing research articles, as illustrated by the F.O.R.M map, has really grown. If you're a research funder, a national government, a ministry, a department, or even a private philanthropy, and you want to explore developing policies for the open sharing of articles, you're no longer in a position of having to start from zero, which honestly we were in the early 2000s. Foundational frameworks like the UNESCO recommendation on open science have provided us with these fantastic principles on which policies can be constructed, and now examples of those actual policies and how they're applied nationally and locally abound, as you can see from this graph. And we have examples of how they're applied from the how can you consider incorporating open research policies into an overall national information policy framework. For example, the OECD in the early 2000s helped provide exemplar language for positioning the need for open sharing of knowledge within national frameworks for information sharing by providing really great foundational language, right? That says information is a valuable national resource, and the economic and societal benefits are maximized when you do one simple thing, when you make it available in a timely and equitable manner to all. So examples for how to position policy language within a national framework exist. We also have great examples across many, many different countries of how that then can be applied and adapted into a more local expression. So taking the sort of positioning within an information policy environment and saying, how can I construct a policy that's then positioned to reflect the sort of national focus or the lens through which my country or my region is approaching open research policies. And this is an example of how that language is playing out here in the United States. As I said, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we were fortunate to have in 2022, the Biden-Harris administration issue a national open science policy that used that framework of the necessity of sharing publicly funded government information or government knowledge, scientific research in a timely manner to all. And the way it's expressed in the United States is sort of, maybe not uniquely, but it certainly captures a flavor of what's important in US policy. And it's expressed as taxpayer access to the results of taxpayer-funded research. And you can see by the way the language is expressed here, it really plays upon the need of urgency that was spurred by the pandemic. And the policy in part just notes that the insights of new and cutting edge research should be immediately available, not just in moments of crisis, not just to fight a pandemic, but always. There should be no delay between taxpayers and the returns, whether they're economic or societal, and their investments on research. So we have these fantastic examples of positioning. And fortunately, it goes further, right? Like even, I shouldn't say even, whether you are a national policymaker who's interested in developing a policy, or you're the head of a research institution or a leader in a higher education institution who's thinking about putting a policy in place, we have examples of language that gets ever more granular for you to be able to build on. Not having to start from zero, I think, is a really important advantage that we have right now. If you look at the ROR map, right, if you look at this, this graph, you can see that the light blue bars are actually institutional higher education open access policies that have been proliferated. So there's examples that are, you know, just growing in scope and in number. And what's really important and really useful about the ROR map as a resource is that it doesn't just note that there's, you know, 57 new policies have been created this year. If you're in a position where you want to take action and create a policy, you can drill down into each one of these policies and get granular information about what's there. So for example, if you're a lead in a research institution and you're thinking about a policy, you can click into the ROR map and browse other institutions that have policies that are already represented in the ROR map. And you can pick an institution or a set of institutions that you think, you know, they play a corollary role, or they have characteristics that are in common with my institution. How are they approaching policy development? What have they done? And you can click on it and get granular information about elements of the policy, what it governs, how it approaches, how it approaches different areas and elements of policy work. So the key message really that I want to try to underscore is that one of the things that's happened over the last several decades that puts us in an action-oriented position that looks completely different than it did 20 years ago when the open movement first started is that we not only have global articulations of first principles and mechanisms to start with, we have examples of the distillation of those principles into policy frameworks on a national and regional level. And further, we have plenty of expressions of individual policies that have been customized for local use. And we have resources that can help us step through and support our ability to step up and to generate either refining policies that already exist in our sphere or starting new ones. And one final note in the policy space that I think is really critically important is that not only do we have exemplars of policies and things that we can use as templates, but we're beginning to see communities and organizations of people who are expert in different areas of elements of policies who are available to also provide expertise. And they tend to be nonprofit organizations who can help step through ever more granular questions that we have as policymakers or as people responsible for policy development as we're working on policies. For example, in the area of enabling rights and rights retention, understanding what licenses to require, or how, if you're a policymaker who wants to enable the green deposit of a final author's manuscript along with publication in an open access journal as a compliance route for a policy, how do you make sure that you are securing the correct rights or articulating those the right way? And we have organizations that are springing up to support policymakers' work, from Creative Commons to Communia to Knowledge Rights 21 to the Authors Alliance, global organizations that can help provide guidance as we step through the process of creating policies. And we see a similar trajectory play out in terms of identifying areas for action in the practice space. Progress has been, I'd say, a little bit slower in this area, but it's not a surprise because the area of open research practices is so much bigger than the policy environment and encompasses so many different potential actions that I think it's not surprising that it's taken a little bit longer for things to gel. But we are seeing the same kind of a trajectory play out in terms of support mechanisms that have begun to emerge that make taking action more achievable on an individual and an institutional level. In the policy space, in the practice space, the approach that's required is a bit different than in the policy space. It requires much more of a recognition that the actions are more granular and they're more discipline specific. From the inception of the open movement and the open access movement, we've heard an iteration as advocates often of open access, open data, open fill in the blank will never work in my discipline because as an astronomer or a geneticist or a social psychologist, we do X in our work. And you can fill in X as any sort of practice that's unique to a specific discipline. And I think there was a lot of frustration in terms of reactions to that as advocates for open research initially. But what's become really important to recognize is that it's true, right? That all disciplines are unique and they do require discipline-specific approaches to be respected and supported. And that as we're thinking about what we can do to affect change in the practice space, we have to start from the notion that that's actually an opportunity for us, right? It's not a massive problem that we can't overcome. That's operating reality, and it gives us an opportunity to really work to meet disciplinary community preferences as we develop and support open research practices. And that requires us really thinking about approaching action from the standpoint of putting ourselves in the community that we are in, or that we're responsible for, or that we're serving in their position, and saying, how do they want to share the knowledge, the research that they're generating? Are they a community that really does see benefits in continuing some operating mode that centers traditional journals, or do they really want to move faster and get into the environment of preprints or a publish, review, curate model? Is it a community or a disciplinary area that really, really wants to be able to center and promote non-English as a first language outlets or locally prioritized research and research collections? Are they more interested in working from the starting point of annotated data sets and kind of going down that trajectory? What is the local preference? And how then can we support those preferences? So really that disciplinary specificity and the sensitivity to that as a starting point is a critical precursor for action in this space. And then we find ourselves as advocates or as leaders in our different communities with the responsibility of needing to support these communities to take action. And whether we like it or not, right? One of the most important ways that we can support researchers taking actions to promote more open and equitable communication and sharing of research and knowledge is by financially supporting the decisions and the mechanisms that they're choosing to use. And that's been a sticking point, right? We've heard time and time again over the last several days, and the conversation in the global community is really centering on the tensions that are arising about things like an article processing charge, an APC-based model for communicating journal articles being in danger of becoming the dominant mode or the single mode for supporting communication. But we have to really work to make sure that that doesn't happen. And again, I think we're positioned in a very fortunate moment in time and in a place where there are a multiplicity of opportunities, of channels that researchers, research communities can choose to go along to share the research outputs in the way that they want. And we have the ability to not be stuck in one bucket that says APCs or nothing, or this one mode, subscriptions or nothing, but we're identifying a continuum of opportunities and mechanisms that can be used to financially support and to sustain the different kinds of research outlets that our communities might want to take. And this slide is just an example of one such continuum, and this is in the area of supporting research article communication that my colleague Raym Crow developed as he was working with not-for-profit publishers and developing risk mitigation transitional strategies from subscription to open models. What were the kinds of choice points, continuums, and then ultimately corresponding business models that we could think of, or mechanisms, components of business models that we could support to help move along that continuum. So as in policy, as in the policy environment, I really do want to underscore we're doing the same thing, right? We're going from this large choice point, this large panoply of choice points, and moving along a continuum of gradually more focused areas where we can take action. And at each level of granularity, the community is being supported by an ever-increasing body of evidence and set of tools and resources to help make action more tractable. And that, of course, plays out also in the final area that I want to touch on just briefly, which is in the area of reforming norms to support open and equitable sharing of knowledge. This is an area where the challenge is probably the biggest, where the systems level aspect or nature of the problem is probably more apparent than even in any other area. What we really are focusing on in changing the norms is talking about what is it that we value in not just individual research communities or disciplines, but as a global research enterprise, as a global educational enterprise. What is it that we value in terms of outputs and behaviors? And we express that value in general by incentivizing and rewarding specific outputs and behaviors. The challenge for us right now is, as I think we all know, the journal publishing system has, to a large extent, conflated the action of communicating research and scholarship with the conferral of prestige, of valuing what those outputs are. It is a very difficult position, I think, to be in, because we have to untangle, first and foremost, the notion of communication and decouple it as being the sole mechanism that can confer prestige, right? We have to really think about moving these two components apart and redefining what constitutes impact, value, not only what constitutes impact, quality, and prestige, but where it's conferred and who confers it. Journals were initially designed to communicate the latest understanding of the state of the disciplines that they covered. And yet we know, and we've seen, that over the last several decades, it's become almost a secondary function. They've become proxies for not only relative quality of an article, but the value of an individual's work. And scholarly societies and communities and disciplinary guilds have seen their imprimaturs replaced by these proxies, impact factors, university rankings. So how do we reverse this situation, right? This is one of the thornier problems, because it really does involve resetting and reclaiming and resetting norms in our communities. And again, one last example of this moving from the global to the granular. One way that we go about untangling things is to be able to articulate what we don't want to do anymore. And global declarations at the level, at the global level, like that of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment or the DORA Declaration, really have played that role in getting us started along that continuum. DORA articulated the fact that we want to move away from a simple reliance on metrics and numerical proxies as the sole or the primary mechanism for judging value and judging impact, and move on to something else. The challenge, once you've articulated what it is you want to say no to, is always being able to articulate, what do you want to say yes to? What do we want to do instead? If we know we don't want to continue the over-reliance on metrics, what is it that we want to move into instead? And it's only in the last few years that we've begun to see some momentum moving towards organized efforts to express that exact articulation. Efforts like COARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment that's burgeoning in Europe, or the Roundtable for Supporting and Realigning Incentives to Support Open Science in the United States, are attempts to say, what is it that we want to do instead? Can we start to define the components that make up the outputs and behaviors that we want to reward, instead of solely relying on metrics to make these determinations? And again, following that theme, that theme of moving from the global to the granular, we're seeing this begin to play out in different disciplines, where some communities, the linguistics community, the social science community, a handful of communities are starting to say, we've signed DORA, we've articulated what we don't want to do. We think we have our sense in our discipline, in our community, of what we do want to do. And now we're going to try the next step in sort of the action chain, which is we're going to try to implement changes in what we value and reward on the local level. And that means articulating them and accepting them in our scholarly societies, like the Linguistic Society of America, and then diffusing those throughout the departments of linguistics in institutions of higher education across the United States and across the world. So that continuum playing out again. And I hope that I've given you some illustrations about that dynamic and how achievable it actually is for the first time for us to move from the aspirational to the actionable. And I'm going to close with just one final example. In the United States, the Biden-Harris administration has declared 2023 as the year of open science, which is wonderful and phenomenal for so many reasons, not in the least because it provides that the stamp, the final stamp of approval, right? That open science, open research is the desired outcome, the desired end game, the move for the new default mode for doing science in the 21st century in the United States. Declaring the year of open science could just be a nice way to tie a bow around the fact that they issued a policy and that, we just want to say we're all behind it and it feels great to be able to declare the year of, something good. But I really appreciate the other thing that the administration and the federal agencies in the US did with declaring the year of open science, which is they kind of put their money where their mouth is in helping people to understand, what do I need to do to contribute to open science becoming the default? And in order to participate in the year of open science in the United States, they've made it very easy for the community and for individuals to consider participating. To be part of promoting the year of open science in the US, you only need to do one of these four things and part of one of these four actions. Right? They've laid out four simple things that people can consider doing to participate: to develop a strategic plan at your institution to promote open science. You don't have to do a full-blown policy, but that action of actually articulating here's the direction that we're going to go in. Take steps to improve the transparency, integrity, equity of reviews in your department, at your journal, in your discipline, right? Those steps forward. Account for open science activities and evaluation. Don't say how. This is not prescriptive, right? This is the totality of the instructions for what you need to do to participate. Simply saying, I'm going to include open sharing of data, in my next tenure dossier, for example, is an action that you can take. Engaging underrepresented communities that I may not have worked with before in the work that I'm doing to advance science. All of these are steps that you can take, and they're steps that feel like you can do them as individuals because they're simple steps. They're simple steps, yes, but if they're steps that if they're done right and done in the number that we need, done at scale, the cumulative impact will be to increase momentum and strengthen the foundation of a global shift towards open research and knowledge sharing. And as noted at the start of this talk, sharing knowledge is fundamental for the progress of society, and it's the goal that we're working towards together. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. Definitely, we hugely missed you over here. And as you could see, what a way to end the second day of the in-person sessions here at F.O.R.M. Really giving us valuable insights on the true meaning of open, not as the goal itself, but as a catalyst, enabler, and facilitator for change, development, and innovation, to really work towards some of our global challenges, and working towards a more equitable knowledge-sharing society. Basically, there was a roadmap for all of us, regardless of our roles, and there were takeaways for all of us. And definitely, this forum and the discussions and the talks are basically here as a way to assist in supporting actionable ways forward towards these goals. A key takeaway for me also was the various business models, that there's no simple answer on the move towards equity, for example, on the equitable and affordable business models that we're, for example, experimenting with Zendi. So I don't want to lose this opportunity, and I would like to give the audience a chance, or if there's any online questions, to ask Heather, but definitely we missed you over here, and we hope you can make it for the next forum. Any questions before we close, or any insights? It's been a long 2 days, and we're just now ready for the lighter section of the program. There's one, can we have a microphone here, please? There's one on that table.
Thank you for a very, very illuminating talk, which provided a roadmap, but most important, it provided hope that something can be done in sharing knowledge, in democratizing knowledge space. And if we remember, knowledge is power. That comes from Socrates, Plato, so on. And democratizing knowledge is democratizing power. That's true democracy. That's enabling, that's empowering. My question is very simple, that what is your take? That why some countries go ahead, jump in, and adopt in all the new ideas, and others just sit back and let these brilliant ideas die? What is your take on that? Because I'm thinking of Estonia. Recently, I did a little bit of research, and what I saw in Estonia was astounding, that the things they are doing using internet in various regards, including, online voting, why other countries are leaving behind. What is your take on that?
Thank you very much for your observation, and in particular for the "knowledge is power" quote. I think it's an extraordinarily important and true observation and point to make. I can't pretend to have any crystal ball insight into why one country or region moves more quickly or more aggressively in one direction or another. But I would say that in terms of an observation that I can make is that when we're wrestling with thinking through things like changing the norms and the cultural expectations of what's valued, I think that provides us with, maybe like a little bit of a microcosm to think about why change happens more quickly in one area than another. In some disciplines, I like to say I was raised by the astronomy community. My first professional job was with the American Astronomical Society. And so I really learned about the norms and ethos of doing science through the lens of high energy physicists and astronomers who collected an enormous amount of digital data. When I was coming up first professionally in the very late 1980s and early 1990s, they were already really relying on digital technology to collect their data, to collect the information that they worked with. And then we're looking at the nascent tools that the National Science Foundation and CERN were building to be able to use them to communicate, right? But their ethos was our data is designed to be shared, right? It's designed to be open and shared. My assumption was that every other discipline would, of course, approach things that way. My second job was with the Society for Neuroscience. And in neuroscience, the ethos was completely different. They weren't holding on to data. They didn't have the ethos of immediate open sharing, but they were holding on to data for other reasons, for reasons that were of value in the particular cultural norm structure that they were in neuroscience. And I think to a certain degree, what we're asking the world to do is to change norms on a global level. So the notion that it's going to happen at the same pace everywhere, that's never going to happen. But I think the best that we can do is to look for the kinds of mechanisms and tools that we might have as individuals and, as organizations, and then collectively as a movement, to show examples of, if your norms are changing, if they do change in this direction, here's the benefits that will accrue. So no silver bullet, but maybe kind of turning the lessons that we're learning from normative values and behaviors that are established even in research and scholarly disciplinary cultures, and approaching different communities in different regions from a stance of generosity and inclusion, and not we want to force you to do it this way because we know something you don't know, but rather please join because it's good for everyone. It'll be good for you as well as good for us.